It is 2 in the morning. You are cold, not the polite, manageable cold of a modern bedroom, where the thermostat dipped a few degrees overnight and you've pulled the duvet up to your chin. And you're fine, actually. You're completely fine. Stop being dramatic. This is a different kind of cold. This is the cold of a building with no central heating, no insulation in the walls, no double-glazed windows, no weather stripping on the door, and a fire that has been burning in the hearth since this afternoon, but whose contribution to the thermal situation of the room is, at 2 in the morning, essentially theoretical. The fire is still technically burning. There are embers. They are producing warmth in the specific localized way of a campfire, meaning that the 3 feet of air immediately above them are considerably warmer than the ambient temperature, and everything beyond that radius has received approximately no benefit. The walls of the room are stone, or timber, or wattle, and daub, depending on your social station, and all of these materials share the quality of having no meaningful insulating properties whatsoever, which means that the temperature inside the building and the temperature outside the building have reached a working agreement in which they are roughly the same, with the inside marginally less miserable, only because the wind isn't hitting you directly. You are in medieval Europe. The century doesn't matter enormously for our purposes. Let's say the 13th or 14th century, the high medieval period, when European civilization has developed the social, architectural, and material culture of sleep into a form that is reasonably representative of what most medieval people most of the time experienced. You are not a king. You are not a hermit. You are somewhere in the large, varied, socially stratified middle of medieval society, and you need to sleep. And the cold is a problem that everyone in your world has, every night, and everyone has developed solutions to. The solutions are what this script is about. Because here's the thing, medieval people did not, in fact, freeze to death in their beds at anything like the rate that the modern imagination, confronted with the cold of a pre-central heating world, might expect. The cold was real, profoundly, consistently, structurally real, in ways that modern people who have lived their entire lives in temperature-controlled environments have genuinely lost the visceral understanding of. But medieval people were not passive victims of the cold. They were people who had been born into a cold world, raised in a cold world, and had developed across generations and accumulated practical wisdom about how to manage it that was woven into every aspect of their lives, their architecture, their clothing, their diet, their social arrangements, their daily schedules, their attitudes toward the body and its needs. The management of cold in the medieval period was not a technology. It was a culture, a set of practices, attitudes, and arrangements that distributed the available warmth across the hours of the night and the months of the winter in ways that were not always comfortable, but were demonstrably sufficient. The population of medieval Europe was not in long-term decline from hypothermia. People were cold, and they managed. And the management is fascinating and strange, and occasionally involves things that the modern sensibility finds deeply surprising, like sharing your bed with multiple people you are not romantically involved with, like going to bed with your head entirely covered, like the specific, systematic role of the pig in medieval domestic heating arrangements, like the medieval science of the bed itself, the technology of mattress and bedding that represented, for many households, the most expensive single investment they owned, like the segmented sleep pattern that virtually all pre-industrial people practiced, and that modern sleep science has recently confirmed is the human default, not the 8-hour block we've been told to aspire to. We're going to cover all of this. We're going to start from the cold itself, what it actually felt like, what it actually meant, and work outward to the architecture, the social arrangements, the technology of warmth, and finally to the sleep itself. How medieval people actually slept, what they expected from sleep, and what the night meant to people who didn't have artificial light to push it back. Let's start with the building, because the building is where you are, and the building is the first problem. Chapter 1. The building, what medieval architecture did and didn't do for the cold. You are in a building that was not designed primarily to keep you warm. This seems like a strange design failure. Buildings are, at the most basic level, shelters, and shelters are, at the most basic level, things that protect you from the weather. You would think that keeping the people inside warm would be high on the list of design priorities for any building in a Northern European climate. And it was, in the sense that the people who built medieval buildings were not indifferent to warmth. They thought about it. They incorporated heat sources into their designs. They made choices that reflected the importance of thermal comfort, but they were making those choices within a set of material and technical constraints that made truly warm buildings essentially impossible to achieve. And the solutions they developed were adaptations to the impossibility rather than escapes from it. Let's start with the peasant longhouse, because this is where the majority of medieval people spent their nights, and because the longhouse represents the most direct confrontation with the problem of cold in medieval domestic architecture. The peasant longhouse of the high medieval period was typically a single-room structure, sometimes with a small internal division, but fundamentally one space, housing both the family and, in the colder months, the family's animals. Not the animals in a separate attached barn that you could close a door between yourself and the animals in the same room. Your room, the room where you sleep. This was not an oversight. This was a heating strategy. The thermal mass of large domestic animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, horses, is significant. A cow produces approximately 1,000 BTUs of heat per hour simply by existing, through the metabolic processes that keep it alive. A single large animal in a closed space makes a measurable difference to the temperature of that space. Several animals, a small herd of cattle, a few pigs, some sheep, make a very significant difference. The medieval peasant who brought his animals inside for the winter was not failing to draw a basic distinction between the domestic and the agricultural. He was making a rational thermal calculation. The animals needed shelter, the family needed warmth. The building could provide both simultaneously, and the result was an interior temperature that was meaningfully warmer than what the building could have achieved without the animals. The smell was what it was. The noise of cattle shifting and breathing, and occasionally expressing opinions about their situation, was present throughout the night. The floor, which was typically beaten earth covered with rushes or straw, accumulated the contributions of both the human and animal occupants in ways that required regular replacement of the rushes. This was the domestic environment of the medieval peasant, and the medieval peasant's relationship with it was the relationship of someone who had never experienced anything different. Not resigned acceptance, but the simple, practical normality of a person for whom this was what home was. The fire was central, literally. The fire of the peasant longhouse was typically a central hearth. A fire, burning on the floor or on a raised stone or clay hearth in the middle of the room without a chimney. The smoke rose and found its way out through a hole in the roof. The Louvre, a raised section of the roof line that allowed smoke to exit while minimizing the entry of rain. This was not perfectly efficient. The smoke didn't all go straight up through the Louvre. Some of it distributed itself through the interior of the building, and the air quality in a longhouse with an active central fire was what you would expect of a space where a wood fire was burning without ventilation. The consequences of this were real and documented. Respiratory conditions were common in medieval populations, and the chronic smoke inhalation of spending every winter inside a poorly ventilated building with a central fire was a contributing factor, but the fire was non-negotiable. Without it, the thermal situation of the longhouse in a northern European winter was not survivable, so the smoke was a cost that was paid. The fire's thermal contribution to the longhouse was significant but not uniform. The area immediately around the fire was warm, genuinely warm, warm enough to be uncomfortable if you were too close. The area further from the fire, toward the walls, was considerably less warm. The walls of the longhouse typically wattle and daub, a framework of woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and manure, or timber frame with infill, had essentially no insulating properties by modern standards. The heat that the fire generated radiated outward from the hearth and was lost through the walls and the roof in a continuous, steady process that the fire had to continuously replace. This meant that the thermal environment of the longhouse was dynamic and stratified, warm at the center, cold at the margins, and continuously cooling as the fire died down overnight, and the heat loss through the building envelope continued unabated. The sleeping arrangement in the longhouse was organized around this thermal reality. People slept close to the fire, or close to the animals, or in whatever position maximized their access to the available warmth. The more prosperous medieval dwelling, the house of a merchant, an artisan, a minor landowner, was architecturally more sophisticated but faced the same fundamental problem in a different form. These buildings had actual chimneys, the chimney which directed smoke out of the building and allowed fires to be built against walls rather than in the center of the room, was one of the significant architectural developments of the medieval period, becoming more widespread in the 12th and 13th centuries. The chimney made the fire more efficient as a heat source, allowed for multiple fires in different rooms, and dramatically improved the air quality of the interior. But the chimney also meant that the fire was a point source of heat rather than a central radiating source, and the rooms of a multi-room house with wall fireplaces had a specific thermal geography, very warm near the fireplace, progressively colder as you moved away from it, and cold at the far wall. The rooms that didn't have fireplaces, and in most medieval houses, the majority of rooms didn't have fireplaces, were unheated, and essentially at outdoor temperature. The great hall of the aristocratic or royal household, the large communal space at the heart of the medieval manor or castle, was heated by one or more large fires, and the hall's function as a communal space meant that the warmth of many bodies, combined with the heat of the fires, could make it a genuinely warm environment during the evening. The problem was that the Great Hall was a public space, not a sleeping space. It was the space for dining, entertainment, and social life, and the sleeping arrangements of the household were in the more private spaces above or adjacent to the hall that were considerably less well heated. The castle, the most architecturally extreme form of medieval domestic space, was famously cold. Stone is an excellent thermal mass in the sense that it stores heat, but it is also an excellent conductor, meaning that the stone walls of a castle were continuously drawing heat from the interior and radiating it to the exterior. The stone floors were cold, the stone walls were cold. The windows, before the widespread use of glass, covered with oiled cloth or shutters that were better than nothing but not much better, were cold. The fires in the castle's fireplaces were large and continuous, but were fighting a losing battle against the thermal mass of the building they were trying to warm. The people who lived in castles knew this. The design responses to castle coldness included the tapestry, which served the dual function of decorating the wall and providing a layer of insulation between the stone and the room's interior, the rushes on the floor, which provided some thermal separation between the cold stone and the feet of the people walking on it, the canopy bed, the curtain bed, the enclosed sleeping arrangements that created a microclimate within the larger cold climate of the room. We'll get to the bed. The bed is important, but first let's talk about what medieval people wore, because the clothing was the first layer of the cold management system, and it was operational 24 hours a day. Chapter 2. The clothing. What medieval people wore to bed, and why it was sensible. The question of what medieval people wore to bed is one that produces some confusion in the modern imagination, partly because of the specific cultural moment we're in, where sleepwear is a defined category of clothing with its own retail sector, and the idea of someone not having dedicated sleepwear feels vaguely incomplete, like forgetting to buy a specialized item you definitely need. Medieval people did not primarily have dedicated sleepwear. They slept in their underclothes, the linen garments that formed the innermost layer of their clothing and that were worn against the skin during the day and retained during the night. For most medieval people, the distinction between day clothing and night clothing was the removal of the outer layers, the tunics, the coats, the various woolen garments that constituted the visible public-facing layer of medieval dress, and the retention of the linen layer underneath. The linen undergarment, the chemise or shirt, which was a loose, long-sleeved garment reaching to approximately the knee or below, was the primary sleeping garment of the medieval period. Linen was the ideal material for the garment worn closest to the skin for several reasons. It was smoother than wool and less irritating to wear continuously. It absorbed moisture from the body and wicketed it away from the skin. It could be laundered more easily than wool, and it was available at various qualities and price points that made it accessible across the social spectrum. The wealthy wore fine linen, soft, finely woven, of good quality, and the less wealthy wore coarser linen, but linen in some form was the baseline sleepwear of medieval Europe across most social levels. The exception was the very poor, who might have limited access to linen and might sleep in whatever they wore during the day, including outer woolen garments. Now let's talk about the head. The medieval understanding of the body's relationship to cold was organized around a specific anatomical priority: the head. The medieval body was understood within the humoral framework we've discussed in other contexts to be particularly vulnerable to the cold at the head. The brain, the humoral center of thought and spirit, was sensitive to cold in ways that made protecting it physiologically and theoretically important. The practical translation of this understanding was, medieval people covered their heads at night. The coif, a close-fitting linen cap that tied under the chin, was worn to bed by men and women across a wide range of social levels. Illuminated manuscripts, the visual evidence of medieval daily life, that gives us our clearest pictures of how medieval people actually behaved, show sleeping figures with their heads covered with remarkable consistency. This was not merely a fashion convention, it was a health practice, supported by medical theory and practical experience, and it made genuine thermal sense. The head is one of the major sites of heat loss from the human body. In cold conditions, covering the head significantly reduces the overall heat loss from the body, which matters enormously when you're trying to maintain body temperature in a cold environment with limited insulation. The medieval habit of sleeping with a covered head was, in this specific respect, exactly the right response to their thermal environment, not because they understood heat transfer in modern physical terms, but because the accumulated practical wisdom of generations in cold buildings had produced the behavioral response that worked. The wool blanket as outer clothing in the bedding context is something we'll address in the bedding chapter, but the clothing piece that connects day and night is the hose, the leg coverings that medieval men wore, and that were not always removed for sleep. The hose were wool stockings that covered the leg from foot to thigh, and in cold conditions, the retention of the hose for sleeping was a rational choice that many people made, particularly in the coldest months. The wealthy had a specific additional layer available to them, the nightgown, not the modern nightgown with its specific gendered associations and its lightweight fabrics, but the medieval nightgown, a heavy, long, sleeved garment that was worn over the chemise for sleeping, providing an additional layer of insulation. The nightgown was a marker of sufficient prosperity to own a garment that served only one function, and it appeared in the wardrobes of the aristocracy, the wealthy merchant class, and the comfortable clergy by the high medieval period. The monastery had its own specific sleeping clothing culture because the monastery had specific institutional requirements about the covering of the body that applied through the night as well as the day. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monastic life, which influenced monasticism throughout the medieval period, specified that monks should sleep clothed and belted, ready to rise at any time for the night offices. The monks slept in their habits or in modified sleeping versions of their habits, fully dressed by the rule's requirement, which meant that the monastic sleeper was considerably more clothed than the secular sleeper. This had thermal advantages, though they were incidental to the rule's spiritual purpose. A monk sleeping fully, clothed in a medieval monastery, which was, with some notable exceptions, a cold building, was warmer than a layperson sleeping in a chemise. The thermal benefit was a byproduct of the institutional spiritual requirement, which is a good example of the way in which medieval cold management was embedded in practices whose primary purposes were not thermal, but whose thermal effects were significant. The specific cold problem that clothing addressed was the transition, the moment of getting up in the night for the latrine, or getting up in the morning, or simply moving within the sleeping space in the cold hours before dawn. The chemise, or the nightgown that you slept in, was what you wore for these transitions, which means you were moving through cold space in a single layer of linen or wool, rather than in the full layered warmth of daytime dress. The medieval solution to this specific cold moment, the getting up cold, was the pre-warmed garment, outer clothing that had been laid near the fire before bed or over the bed itself, so that it was warm when you put it on rather than cold from hanging in the unheated room overnight. The fireplace of the wealthy medieval household served this function deliberately. Garments were hung near the fire in the evening to warm them for morning, and the specific practice of warming your clothing before putting it on was a standard cold management technique that appears in the advice literature and the documentary records of medieval households. It was and remains extremely effective, and the fact that we now have radiators to do the same job doesn't make the medieval version less rational. Before we move to the bedding, let's address one more clothing-related cold management practice that is well documented and that illustrates the specific pragmatism of the medieval approach to warmth: the bed cap. The bed cap was a larger, softer version of the sleeping coif, a substantial head covering designed specifically for sleeping, often made of softer material than the daytime coif, sometimes with ear covers or ties that secured it more firmly. The bed cap appears in inventories of wealthy households, in the visual evidence of illuminated manuscripts, and in the medical literature that recommended its use for health reasons. It was worn over the coif in particularly cold conditions, providing a double layer of head coverage. The bed cap was, by the 15th century, a distinct item in the wardrobes of the wealthy. It was also, in its functional essentials, exactly what your grandmother wore. The sleeping cap tradition persisted from the medieval period through the early modern period and into the 19th century, when central heating and the changed cultural associations of the sleeping cap brought the practice to an end in most Western contexts. The medieval peasant who wrapped his coif more tightly against the cold, the medieval merchant who had a specific cap for sleeping, and the Victorian grandfather in his nightcap were all doing the same thing for the same reason, across 6 centuries of consistent cold management. Chapter 3. The fire, the heart of the medieval thermal system, and how it was managed through the night. The fire was everything, not metaphorically. The fire was the single most important element of the medieval thermal system, the technology around which all the other cold management practices were organized, and whose management through the evening and overnight hours was one of the most important practical skills of medieval domestic life. Understanding the medieval fire means understanding something about fuel, because the fuel shaped everything about how the fire was used and how it was managed. Wood was the primary fuel of medieval Europe, but wood was not a single undifferentiated resource. Different woods had dramatically different properties as fuel: their burn rates, their heat output, their production of sparks, and smoke, their behavior when wet. The management of a wood fire in a medieval household required genuine expertise, the knowledge of which woods to use for what purposes, how to build a fire that would last through the night without constant attention, how to bank a fire to preserve it until morning, how to manage the draft in a fireplace or central hearth to maximize heat output while minimizing smoke. The banking of the fire, the practice of covering the fire with ash or peat in the evening so that it burned slowly overnight and could be easily revived in the morning, was one of the most important techniques in the medieval domestic repertoire. A properly banked fire could be kept alive for 12 hours or more without active management, providing a source of warmth that, while less intense than an active fire, was significantly better than nothing, and could be quickly revived at dawn to provide the heat needed for morning activities. The banking technique varied by fuel and by context. With wood, the large logs were arranged to burn down to a substantial bed of hot coals, and then the coals were covered with ash, the fine insulating ash of the already burned wood, which reduced the oxygen supply to the coals and caused them to smolder slowly rather than burning freely. The next morning, you swept aside the ash, exposed the still hot coals, added small pieces of dry kindling, and the fire was revived without the need to start from scratch with a flint and steel. Peat, the compressed organic material cut from boglands, the primary fuel of many areas of northern and western Europe, where wood was scarce, had properties that made it particularly suited to overnight burning. Peat burned slowly, produced sustained heat over a long period, and banked exceptionally well. The dense material holding heat for many hours under its ash covering. In the peat-burning regions of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of northern France and the Low Countries. The keeping of the fire, the practice of maintaining a continuous fire that was never fully extinguished, preserved overnight generation after generation, was a significant cultural practice with religious and social dimensions beyond its purely practical function. The keeping of the fire was, in these traditions, not just a practical convenience, but a symbol of the household's continuity and well-being. A fire that went out entirely was a bad omen, and a practical disaster requiring the borrowing of fire from a neighbor, which was available and which was what you did, but which represented a dependency that the self-sufficient household sought to avoid. The fire that was always burning was the household that was always alive, and the responsibility of maintaining it through the night was taken seriously. In the wealthier household with a proper fireplace, the management of the fire through the night was typically a servant's responsibility. The last person awake in the evening, often a household servant designated for this purpose, was responsible for banking the fires, ensuring they would last through the night, and in the morning, reviving them before the household's important members needed to be warm. This was not a minor responsibility. The household that woke to cold fires in January in a castle had a genuinely difficult morning, and the servant who let the fires go out faced the specific displeasure of a cold employer. The medieval fireplace was the center of the room's social and thermal life in the evening, and the transition from evening to night was managed around the fire. After the evening meal, the household gathered at the fire in the great hall for communal gatherings, the fire in the solar or private chamber for the family. And this gathering served the thermal function of loading up on warmth before the cold of the sleeping hours. The medieval understanding of the body's relationship to cold included the concept of storing warmth, the idea that a body that was warm before sleep was better equipped to manage the cold of the night, and the evening fireside gathering was in part a practical thermal preparation for sleep. The bedtime fire ritual in a wealthy household typically involved the lord or lady's chamber being prepared for the night. The fire built up to a good heat. The chamber warmed, the bedding turned back. The warming of the bedding, specifically the use of a warming pan, was one of the most important fire-based thermal technologies of the medieval period, and it deserves extended attention. The warming pan was a long-handled pan, typically made of copper or brass, with a pierced lid that allowed heat to escape while containing the burning material inside. The pan was filled with hot coals from the fire and then moved through the bed, slid between the sheets and blankets, passed along the length of the sleeping surface, transferring the heat of the coals to the bedding and warming the interior of the bed before the sleeper got in. A properly warmed bed in a cold medieval chamber was a genuinely different experience from an unwarmed bed. The warming pan heated the sheets and the blankets in the space where the body would lie, creating a pocket of warmth that the body's own heat would sustain through the night once the sleeper was inside. The thermal logic was simple. Get in warm, and your own body heat will keep you warm. Get in cold, and your body has to first warm the bedding and then warm itself, which is a significantly less comfortable process. The warming pan required the management of the fire. You needed hot coals to put in it, and the timing of the bed preparation was coordinated with the fire management in ways that were part of the domestic expertise of the medieval household. Too early, and the bed would have cooled before the sleeper arrived. Too late, and the coals would be too fresh and too hot, risking scorching the bedding. The correct timing and the correct temperature of the coals was practical knowledge that experienced household servants had, and that the less experienced had to learn. The pot of hot water or hot stones as bed warmers were simpler versions of the same principle. A ceramic pot filled with hot water from the fire, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns, placed at the foot of the bed before retiring. This was the lower-cost alternative to the copper warming pan, available to households that didn't have the metalwork but did have fire and water. The hot stone, a flat stone that had been sitting near the fire and had absorbed its heat, wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed, was the version available to those with no metal vessel at all. These were not minor luxuries. They were, in the thermal context of a medieval winter night, the difference between getting into a bed that was cold enough to be genuinely distressing and getting into a bed that felt warm and safe. The investment of time and effort in warming the bed before sleep was a standard practice of medieval households at all but the most desperate levels of poverty, because the alternative, the unwarmed cold bed in a cold room, was an experience that medieval people, with their more intimate and unavoidable relationship with cold, found as unpleasant as we would find it. The fire in the morning, the revival of the banked fire, the production of the warmth that would allow the household to function through the day, was the transition from the night's thermal regime to the day's. The first person up in the morning had the task of reviving the fire, and the cold of the early morning in a medieval building, before the fire had had time to warm the space, was the specific worst cold of the day. The cold that you moved through as quickly as possible, that you managed with the pre-warmed outer garments we discussed earlier, that the experienced medieval person had developed a set of efficient, practiced responses to. You did not linger in cold morning air. You moved from warm bed to warm enough clothes, to revived fire as efficiently as the household management allowed. This efficiency was not laziness. It was the thermal wisdom of people who knew exactly how cold a pre-modern building in January was, and had organized their morning practices accordingly. Chapter 4. The bed, the most important piece of furniture. Medieval people owned the bed was not furniture, not in the modern sense of furniture as decorative or functional objects that you acquire, use until they wear out, and replace with other furniture. The medieval bed, particularly the high-quality bed of a prosperous household, was a capital investment, a status symbol, an heirloom passed through generations, and the single most valuable object that most medieval families owned. This requires some explanation, because the modern relationship with beds is profoundly different from the medieval one. We spend a significant amount of money on mattresses, but we think of mattresses as consumer goods with an expected lifespan of a decade or so. We don't will our mattresses to our children. We don't list our mattresses among our most treasured possessions in legal documents. We don't have the mattress carried from house to house when we move, because it is too valuable to leave behind. Medieval people did all of these things, because medieval beds were expensive in a way that the modern mind, accustomed to the economies of mass production, has difficulty fully grasping. Let's start with the mattress, because the mattress was the foundational element of the bed, and the component whose quality made the most difference to both comfort and warmth. The highest quality medieval mattress was stuffed with feathers, specifically with down, the soft, fine underfeathers of geese or ducks that have extraordinary insulating properties. A feather-stuffed mattress was warm in the specific way of a sleeping bag stuffed with down. The feathers trapped air between them, creating a layer of insulation between the sleeper and whatever was beneath, and the compressed feathers directly under the sleeper's body distributed the pressure and provided cushioning. Down is still among the best natural insulating materials available. A good down mattress in the medieval period was functionally excellent. It was warm, it was comfortable, it was durable, and it was also extraordinarily expensive. The cost was a function of the labor required to produce it. Each goose or duck produced only a small amount of down. The down had to be cleaned and sorted and prepared. The mattress had to be sewn and filled and maintained. A high-quality feather mattress represented a significant investment and was treated accordingly. Below the feather mattress, in terms of cost and quality, the wool mattress, stuffed with processed wool or wool waste. Also warm, somewhat less so than down, but significantly more accessible for households of modest means. The wool mattress was the standard bedding of the prosperous artisan or merchant class, comfortable enough and warm enough to serve its function, though not the luxury of the aristocratic feather bed. Below that, the straw mattress, a fabric sack stuffed with straw or hay, which provided physical padding between the sleeper and the board or rope base of the bed frame. The straw mattress was cheap, replaceable, and everywhere. It was also not particularly warm, in that straw doesn't have the insulating properties of feathers or wool. It was, however, infinitely better than sleeping on the bare ground or a bare wooden surface, and its thermal contribution to the sleeping situation was not zero. The trapped air in the straw provided some insulation. The very poor slept on straw pallets directly on the floor, the straw mattress without even the benefit of a bed frame. The floor was cold, and the pallet provided limited insulation between the sleeper and the cold floor, and this was the worst sleeping situation available in the medieval domestic range. It was also the most common for a population in which a significant fraction lived at or near subsistence level. The bed frame itself, the structure that elevated the sleeper above the floor, was a meaningful thermal improvement over floor sleeping, regardless of the mattress quality, because it created an air gap between the sleeper and the cold floor that provided some insulation. The floor was the coldest part of the room. Cold air is denser and sinks, meaning that the lowest air in the room was the coldest. An elevation above the floor removed the sleeper from the coldest zone of the thermal environment. The wealthy medieval bed was an architectural object, a four-poster bed with a wooden canopy and heavy curtains on all four sides, and sometimes the top as well, creating an enclosed sleeping space within the larger room. The curtained bed was, in the thermal context of the medieval period, a brilliant piece of engineering. The curtains, heavy wool or linen hangings that could be drawn closed around the bed, created a microclimate within the bed space that was warmer than the ambient temperature of the room by a meaningful degree. The physics of the curtained bed was straightforward. The sleeper's body heat warmed the air inside the enclosed bed space, and the curtains prevented this warmed air from circulating into the cold room and being replaced by cold air. The temperature inside a properly curtained bed in a cold room could be significantly warmer than the room itself, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer, which, in the context of a room at near freezing temperature, made the difference between comfortable sleeping and genuinely difficult sleeping. The canopy bed was also a status symbol of the first order. The height of the canopy, the quality of the hangings, the elaborateness of the carving on the wooden posts, all of these were visible markers of the owner's wealth and social position. A great lord's bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a statement about his place in the world, visible to the household members and guests who had access to the private chambers. The lord's bed, in the context of the medieval household, was a semi-public object. The levee, the formal ceremony of the lord's rising in the morning, which, in its most elaborate form, involved the attendance of household members, and even guests, while the lord dressed and prepared for the day, meant that the bed was a social space, as well as a sleeping space. This semi-public character of the aristocratic bed is one of the features of medieval sleep culture that most surprises modern sensibilities, but it was a natural outgrowth of the social organization of the medieval household, where the distinction between public and private was drawn differently than we draw it. The bedding, the layers placed over and around the sleeper within the bed, was the other major component of the medieval bed system, and it was also expensive and important. The bottom sheet, the sheet that lay between the sleeper and the mattress, was linen, the same material as the sleeper's chemise. The combination of linen sheet against linen chemise was smooth, comfortable, and easy to launder, which mattered because the sheet was the part of the bedding most directly in contact with the sleeper's body, and accumulated perspiration and skin oils that required regular washing. Above the sleeper, blankets, woven wool of varying quality depending on the household's resources, were the primary upper bedding, and they were used in layers. One blanket was insufficient in a cold, medieval winter. 2 or 3 wool blankets, properly positioned and tucked, provided the layered insulation that the sleeping body needed to maintain its temperature through a cold night. The coverlet or counterpane, the outermost layer, often more decorative than purely functional, covered the blankets and added a final layer of insulation. The coverlet of the wealthy household was often fur-lined, the inside surface covered with fur, typically squirrel or rabbit for modest households, ermine or sable for the very wealthy. The fur-lined coverlet was as warm as the quality of the fur allowed, and the fur of small animals, with their fine, dense undercoat designed for the same purpose of cold management in the animal's own life, was genuinely effective insulation. The fur-lined coverlet was the most expensive single piece of bedding, and it appeared regularly in medieval wills and inventories as a valuable bequest, passed from parent to child, listed alongside silver plate and jewelry as among the household's most valuable possessions. The practicality of the fur was also the luxury of the fur. It was both the best available insulation and the most ostentatious display of wealth, in the specific medieval fashion where the practical and the symbolic were rarely separated. The pillow, the filled textile cushion supporting the sleeper's head, was the final component of the medieval bed system, and it was also stuffed with feathers in the best versions. The pillow contributed to warmth by keeping the head elevated from the cold mattress surface, and the quality of the pillow, like the quality of the mattress, was a reliable indicator of the household's resources. For the poor, a folded garment serving as a pillow, or a rolled-up bundle of clothing or nothing, the straw pallet beneath providing whatever cushion was available. For the wealthy, multiple pillows of fine linen stuffed with down, arranged in the quantities and configurations that the household's resources could sustain. The medieval bed in its full aristocratic version, the four-poster with curtains, the feather mattress, the linen sheets, the wool blankets, the fur-lined coverlet, the down pillows, the bed warmed before retiring with a copper warming pan, was the most thermally sophisticated sleeping environment available in the pre-industrial world, and it was genuinely effective. People who slept in this environment were warm. The problem was that this environment was available to a very small fraction of the medieval population. The great mass of medieval people slept in beds that were substantially less elaborate, on mattresses of lesser quality, under blankets that were fewer and thinner. The cold management system of the medieval bed was, like most good things in the medieval period, stratified by wealth, in ways that made the experience of the wealthy and the experience of the poor not merely different in degree, but different in kind. Chapter 5. The social arrangements. Who slept with whom and why it was thermal logic. You are not sleeping alone. This is probably the single most important fact about medieval sleep that the modern imagination consistently misses, because the modern assumption that the default sleeping arrangement is one person, one bed in a private room, is so deeply embedded in contemporary domestic culture that it functions as an assumed baseline rather than a specific historical choice. It is not a baseline. It is a very recent development, a product of the specific economic conditions of industrial and post-industrial society that made the private bedroom achievable for ordinary households, and a product of the cultural values that made privacy in sleep desirable rather than simply unavoidable. For the vast majority of human history, in the vast majority of cultures, sleep was a communal activity, not because people didn't understand privacy, but because privacy and sleep was a luxury that required resources most people didn't have, and because the communal sleeping arrangement was, in the thermal context of a pre-industrial world, dramatically warmer than sleeping alone. Let's be specific about the numbers, because the numbers are important. A human body at rest generates approximately 70 to 80 watts of heat. roughly the same as an incandescent light bulb. In the enclosed space of a curtained bed or under a shared pile of blankets, two human bodies generate twice that heat output in the same space. Three bodies generate 3 times. The arithmetic of shared body heat is direct and significant. More bodies in the same sleeping space means more warmth. And in a medieval winter, more warmth was not a luxury. It was survival. The family bed, the sleeping arrangement in which parents and children shared a single bed or sleeping space, was the norm for most medieval households below the aristocratic level. This was not chosen for warmth exclusively. It was also a function of the simple geometry of the one-room house. If there is one room and one sleeping space, everyone sleeps in the same room and the same space, but the thermal benefit of shared sleeping was real and was understood, and the arrangement was maintained, even in households with sufficient space for separate sleeping, because the warmth it provided was genuine and the cold it protected against was real. The medieval advice literature, the various texts on household management, health, and daily life that circulated in the period, occasionally addresses the question of sleeping arrangements, and the thermal dimension appears in these discussions. The warming of the bed through shared body heat was a recognized property of communal sleeping, and the specific recommendation that children should sleep near adults, both for warmth and for safety, appears in the literature of the period. The servants of the household slept in proximity to the family, often in the same room or in an immediately adjacent space. This was partly a function of the servant's role. They needed to be available if needed during the night, and partly a thermal arrangement in which the household's sleeping population was concentrated in the spaces nearest the heat sources. The great hall, after the evening gathering had ended, sometimes served as a sleeping space for the household's lower servants and guests. The floor covered with rushes, the bodies distributed around the dying fire, in whatever arrangement maximized warmth. The inn was the communal sleeping arrangement in its most extreme form, outside the household, and medieval inn accommodation illuminates the social norms of shared sleeping more vividly than the domestic context, because it was a commercial transaction that left documentary and anecdotal records. The medieval inn did not offer private rooms as a standard accommodation. The standard accommodation was a shared bed, sometimes a shared room with multiple beds, sometimes a single large room with multiple people sleeping in proximity. The traveler, who arrived at a medieval inn expecting a private room, was a traveler with very specific expectations that the medieval inn industry was not organized to meet. You shared your bed with whoever else was sharing it, and you managed this with the practical, unsentimental approach of someone for whom the arrangement was the normal baseline of sleeping, rather than an unusual imposition. The recorded complaints about inn sleeping, the snoring of strangers, the flea infestation of inn beds, the smell of fellow travelers after a day's journey, appear in the literature of the period and tell you that people found these things annoying, which means they were aware of the discomfort. They do not tell you that people found the sharing itself fundamentally wrong or surprising. The discomfort was the specific discomfort of bad fellow travelers. The sharing was simply how inn accommodation worked. The fleas, by the way, deserve a moment, because the flea was one of the defining features of the medieval sleeping environment, regardless of social level. The flea and its companion, the louse, inhabited bedding with the comprehensive presence of organisms that had found an ideal ecological niche. The warmth of the occupied bed, the availability of the human blood supply, and the limited cleaning of the bedding in most households created conditions that fleas exploited thoroughly. The response to fleas in the bed was not the elimination of fleas. That was not achievable with the tools available, but their management. Fine-toothed combs for removing lice from hair and bedding. The beating and airing of bedding to reduce the population. The use of aromatic herbs, lavender, wormwood, tansy, whose repellent properties were recognized in the folk and formal medical tradition. The cat maintained in the household partly for rodent control, and partly because a cat sleeping in the bed was a flea management strategy as well as a warmth strategy. The cat attracted fleas away from the human sleepers and toward itself, reducing the human flea burden. The cat in the medieval bed was not a modern pet-keeping behavior projected backward. It was, among other things, a deliberate practical choice that the households that maintained cats understood as providing specific benefits, including the management of the overnight flea population. The affection was genuine too, in the way that the useful and the beloved are not mutually exclusive. The cat that kept your bed warmer and your flea burden lower was easy to be fond of. Back to the social arrangements and their thermal logic. The monastery was the institutional context in which communal sleeping was most formally organized, and the Benedictine tradition's prescription for monastic dormitory sleeping provides one of the most detailed pictures we have of institutionally managed communal sleep. The monks slept in the dormitory, the common sleeping hall, in individual beds, arranged in rows, clothed as the rule required, with a lamp kept burning through the night. The dormitory arrangement combined the privacy of individual beds with the warmth of many bodies in the same space. A medieval version of the boarding school dormitory, organized around the same practical thermal reality. The many bodies in the dormitory raised the ambient temperature of the space above what any individual body in a private room could have achieved. The dormitory also had the social management function of preventing the monks from sleeping in ways that the rule considered inappropriate. The light in the dormitory, the proximity of other monks, the scheduled interruptions of the night offices, all served to keep the sleeping community visible to itself in ways that the private room did not allow. The communal sleeping arrangement was, in the monastic context, simultaneously a thermal solution, a practical convenience, and a spiritual discipline. The specific sleeping arrangement that most surprises modern audiences is the bed sharing between adults of the same sex who had no romantic relationship. The male guests who shared a bed at an inn, the journeyman craftsmen who shared sleeping space at their master's house, the students at universities who shared beds in their college accommodations. This was ordinary, normal, unremarkable behavior, because the modern framework in which bed sharing carries specific implications that the participants had to manage was not the operative framework. The operative framework was thermal and practical. Beds were expensive, space was limited, heat was generated by bodies, and sharing a bed with a man you'd met this afternoon at an inn in December was how you stayed warm enough to sleep. The social intimacy of shared sleeping, the proximity, the physical contact, the sharing of the breath-warmed air of the enclosed bed space, was managed with the casual ease of people for whom it was normal, rather than the self-conscious awareness of people for whom it was transgressive. There were social rules about bed sharing, of course. The etiquette of who shared a bed with whom was organized by social rank. You didn't put a high-status guest in a bed with a low-status stranger. The household's management of guest accommodation involved matching the quality of the sleeping arrangement to the guest's status in ways that the household's reputation depended on getting right. The lord who put an important guest in an inadequate bed or with an inappropriate bedfellow was failing in the hospitality obligations that the medieval social code imposed. But within the same social level, the sharing was unremarkable. The two merchants traveling together who shared a bed at an inn were simply two people who needed to sleep, and the bed was warmer for both of them. And the morning came, and they went their separate ways. The specific modern discomfort with this arrangement is a product of the modern private sleeping as default framework, not of any universal human instinct about sleeping proximity. The warmth generated by shared sleeping in the medieval context was, in the coldest months of a northern European winter, not a comfort measure. It was sometimes the margin between dangerous cold and survivable cold. The medieval person sleeping alone in a cold room with inadequate bedding was in a genuinely worse thermal position than the same person sharing the same bed and bedding with one or more others. The thermal arithmetic was simple and direct, and the social arrangements of medieval sleeping were organized around it. Chapter 6. The Food. What medieval people ate and drank to fight the cold from the inside. The thermal management of the medieval night didn't begin when you climbed into bed. It began at the evening meal, because the medieval understanding of the body's relationship to cold included a clear and largely correct intuition that what you ate and drank affected your body's capacity to generate and retain heat. The humoral theory, the medical framework that organized medieval thinking about health and the body, provided a specific theoretical context for this intuition. Foods in the humoral system were classified by their qualities: hot, cold, moist, or dry. Hot foods increased the body's internal heat. Cold foods reduced it. The management of the body's thermal state through diet was, in the humoral framework, a medical practice as well as a practical one, and the advice of the medical literature about what to eat in winter was organized around the principle that the body needed hot and warming foods to compensate for the cold and moist qualities of the winter season. The hot and warming foods of the medieval dietary tradition were, in large part, exactly the foods that modern nutrition and physiology would also recommend for cold conditions: high-fat, high-protein, calorie-dense foods that provided the metabolic fuel for the body's heat-generating processes. The correlation between the humoral classification and the actual thermal utility was not accidental. Centuries of practical experience in cold environments had shaped the dietary culture to favor foods that actually worked, and the humoral theory provided the explanatory framework that organized and transmitted this practical wisdom. Pottage was the foundational food of the medieval poor, and it was, in its standard winter form, a genuinely good, cold-weather food. Pottage was a thick, grain-based stew. The grain might be oats, barley, or whatever was available, cooked with whatever vegetables and fats the household could contribute. A thick pottage with a good fat content, lard, bone marrow, the fat of whatever animal had been butchered recently, was a high-calorie, high-fat, hot meal that did exactly what the body needed it to do, provided substantial energy in a form that kept the metabolic furnace burning through the cold night. The warming spices, ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, were classified in the humoral system as hot and dry, and their use in food and drink was recommended specifically for warming the body in cold conditions. These spices were expensive, imported from the East through the trading networks that connected medieval Europe to the spice-producing regions of Asia, and their cost meant that their use was largely restricted to the households that could afford them. But the principle of warming the body through hot, spiced food was understood across the social spectrum, and the cheaper warming herbs available to the poor, mustard, horseradish, garlic, onions, served the same functional purpose with the locally available materials. The evening meal, the supper, the last meal before the night, was understood in the medical literature as having a specific role in the management of the night's cold. The advice was to eat a moderate, warming supper, substantial enough to fuel the body through the night, but not so heavy as to disrupt sleep by the digestive labor of processing an excessive meal. The specific recommendation for warming foods at supper, the hot pottage, the spiced wine, the foods that increased the body's internal heat, was a practical thermal strategy as much as a gastronomic preference. Ale was the standard drink of the medieval poor. Not wine, which was expensive and geographically limited in its production, but ale, the fermented grain beverage that was brewed in most households and that served as the primary liquid of daily life for much of the medieval population. Ale had a modest alcohol content, considerably lower than modern beer, the weak ale of everyday consumption being perhaps 2 to 3% alcohol. And it provided calories, some warmth from the alcohol, and the genuine comfort of a hot drink when it was served heated, which it often was in winter. Heated ale, sometimes spiced, sometimes with honey added, the various warming ale drinks that appear in the medieval documentary record, was the cold weather comfort drink of the majority of the population. The ale warmed before the fire and drunk at the end of the evening was thermal management in liquid form, the warmth of the liquid itself, the calories of the fermentable sugars, the modest vasodilatory effect of the alcohol, all contributing to the body's thermal state before sleep. Hippocras was the spiced wine drink of the wealthy. Wine combined with honey and a mixture of warming spices, heated and strained through a bag. The Hippocrates sleeve, which gave the drink its name, served warm as both a digestive and a warming drink. The recipe for Hippocras appears in virtually every medieval cookbook and household management text, a sign of how central it was to the evening routine of the prosperous household. It was the medieval hot toddy, and it served the same function, not dramatically medicinal, but genuinely pleasant and thermally useful in the way that a warm, spiced alcoholic drink is always thermally useful in cold conditions. The specific medieval drink that combined the most thermal properties in a single vessel was posset, a mixture of hot milk or cream, with ale or wine, sometimes spiced, sometimes with eggs added, served hot. Posset was both a nightly comfort drink and a medical preparation. It was recommended in the medical literature for warming the body, for promoting sleep, and for various conditions related to cold and chill. The modern hot milk, as a sleep aid, is a direct descendant of the medieval posset tradition and the sleep-promoting properties of warm milk related to its tryptophan content and the psychological comfort of a warm drink, are genuine enough that the tradition persisted through the intervening centuries without losing its credibility. The wealthy medieval household had access to a range of foods and drinks for the evening that served the thermal preparation for sleep more effectively than anything available to the poor. The spiced wine, the rich pottage with good fat content, the warming spices, the hot posset before bed, all of these were available to households with the resources for them, and they made a genuine difference to the body's thermal state at the beginning of the night. The poor had ale and pottage, and these were also real and also helpful within the limitations of cost and availability. The pottage of the peasant household, thick with whatever fat and grain were available, was a better cold weather food than the more refined preparations of the wealthy, closer in its actual nutritional profile to what the body needed for warmth than the elaborate dishes of aristocratic cuisine. The peasant, who went to bed full of hot pottage, was better prepared for the cold of the night than the aristocrat who had eaten moderately and elegantly, which is one of the numerous ways in which the medieval social hierarchy did not straightforwardly map onto physical well-being. The digestion of food itself generated heat. The thermic effect of food, in modern nutritional terminology, means that the metabolic processing of a meal produces measurable increases in body heat. The medieval understanding of this was framed in terms of the digestive fire. The internal heat that processed food was both fed by and generated by the meal. But the practical observation was correct. A person who had recently eaten a substantial meal was warmer than a person who had not. This observation shaped the timing of the evening meal and the interval between eating and sleeping. The advice literature was divided on the ideal timing. Some texts recommended eating well before sleep to allow digestion to proceed. Others recommended eating close to bedtime to retain the warmth of the digestive process through the first hours of sleep. The practical behavior of different households reflected different positions in this debate, and the truth that neither side could fully capture was that the timing made less difference than the content. A high-fat, high-calorie, hot meal, eaten reasonably close to bedtime, was the best thermal preparation for a cold medieval night, and the households that had access to such meals were in better thermal shape than those that didn't. The morning food, the breakfast that greeted the medieval person after the cold night, was also organized around thermal logic. Pottage at breakfast, hot, substantial, warming, the body refueled after the overnight fast, and the thermal demands of the cold night. The specific medieval breakfast culture, with its emphasis on hot food eaten early, was a thermal recovery meal as much as a preparation for the day's work, and the households that managed it well were the households that had the food and the fire to produce it. Chapter 7. The segmented sleep, the two-sleep pattern, and the night between here is something that was true for virtually every pre-industrial person in Europe, and that was not known to modern sleep science until the historian A. Roger Eckert began researching it in the 1980s and published his findings in 2001. Medieval people did not sleep for 8 consecutive hours. Nobody did. The 8-hour sleep block that modern people are told to aspire to. The solid, uninterrupted night of sleep from a defined bedtime to a defined wake time is a product of the artificial lighting that allows us to extend social activity well into the night, followed by the industrial work schedule that requires us to be functional at a specific hour in the morning, followed by the shift from darkness as the natural boundary of daily life to darkness as something that can be pushed back indefinitely. Before artificial lighting made extended evening social life possible, before the alarm clock and the factory whistle imposed a fixed morning start time, people went to bed when it got dark or shortly after, and they woke in the middle of the night, and they did things for an hour or two, and then they went back to sleep until morning. This was not insomnia. This was not a sleeping disorder. This was the normal baseline human sleep pattern in the conditions under which human beings lived for the vast majority of their evolutionary and historical existence. The evidence Eckert found was in the language. The medieval documentary record, the letters, the diaries, the literary texts, the court records, the medical literature, is full of references to the first sleep and the second sleep. Not in the way that a modern person writing about insomnia would refer to waking in the night with the self-consciousness of someone describing a problem, but in the offhand, unremarkable way of someone describing a normal pattern that their audience understood without explanation. The first sleep, the initial sleep period after going to bed, lasted roughly the first half of the night, beginning an hour or two after dark and ending around midnight or in the early hours of the morning. The sleeper then woke, naturally without alarm, and spent an interval, typically an hour or two, in a state between waking and sleeping in the quiet and darkness of the middle of the night. This interval between the two sleeps was not considered wasted time or a problem to be solved. It was a recognized part of the night's structure, and the activities that people undertook during it were varied, documented, and revealing of the specific character of the pre-industrial night. Prayer was the most common activity reported in the documentary record. The interval between first and second sleep was considered, in the medieval Christian framework, an especially propitious time for prayer. The quiet of the deep night, the absence of the day's distractions, the liminal state between sleeping and waking that was felt to be particularly close to the spiritual. The night offices of the monastic tradition, matins and lauds, the prayers performed in the middle of the night, were organized around this interval, and the timing of the monastic night office was not arbitrary, but reflected the natural sleep pattern of the population that the monastic schedule was organizing. The layperson who woke between first and second sleep and prayed quietly in the dark was doing something that the church's pastoral literature encouraged, and that felt, in the specific quality of the nighttime consciousness, natural rather than effortful. The prayers of the night were a different prayer from the prayers of the day, more intimate, less performative, the private conversation of the individual soul with God, in the silence that only the deep night provided. Sex. This appears in the documentary record with less frequency than prayer, but enough consistency to be noted, and the medical literature of the period recommended the interval between first and second sleep as an ideal time for marital relations, not primarily for pleasure, but for conception. The medical understanding of the period held that the state of partial arousal from sleep made conception more likely, and the warmth of the bed at that hour was considered favorable. Whether the medical theory was correct is less relevant than the fact that the interval was considered an appropriate time for intimacy, which tells you something about the relaxed, unhurried quality of the first sleep to second sleep interval. Lying awake and thinking. This sounds unremarkable until you consider what it means in the specific context of the pre-industrial night. The total darkness, the silence that a pre-industrial night could achieve in the countryside. A silence broken only by wind and animals, and the distant sounds of other sleeping households. The absence of any of the stimulation or distraction that the modern environment fills, to be idle mind with. The interval between first and second sleep was, by the accounts of those who described it, a time of unusually vivid and undistracted thought, the kind of thought that the day's activity crowded out, the kind of reflection that came when there was nothing else competing for attention. Reading, for those who had access to light and literacy, which was a small fraction of the population but a disproportionately vocal one in the documentary record. The candle, or the rushlight, providing illumination for quiet reading in the middle of the night, the household asleep around you, the specific intimacy of reading in the deep dark, getting up for the latrine, the most practically necessary of the nocturnal activities, and the one that illustrates most directly the thermal challenges of the middle of the night waking period. The latrine was outside or in an unheated attached structure or, in the case of wealthy households, accessible via a garderobe tower. That was inside the building but not heated. Going to the latrine in the middle of a winter night was a journey from the relative warmth of the occupied bed into the cold of the unheated room, through the cold of the corridor or passage, into the cold of the latrine space. This journey was managed with the same practical efficiency that the medieval morning involved. You moved through the cold quickly. You took whatever outer covering was available to wrap around yourself for the transit. You returned to the bed as efficiently as possible. The warming pan had been used hours before, and the bed was no longer actively warm from it, but the body heat of the sleeper or sleepers had maintained the enclosed bed space at a temperature meaningfully above the ambient room temperature, and returning to it was returning to warmth. The chamber pot was the wealthy household's alternative to the nighttime outdoor journey, a ceramic vessel kept beneath the bed or nearby for nocturnal use, eliminating the outdoor journey at the cost of a vessel that needed to be emptied in the morning. The chamber pot appears in medieval household inventories with regularity, and its widespread use tells you something about the practical calculation of medieval households. The cold of the outdoor latrine journey at midnight was enough of a deterrent that people invested in the alternative rather than simply accepting the journey. The specific quality of consciousness during the interval between first and second sleep was noted in the medical literature with a precision that suggests it was recognized as a distinct mental state. Contemporaries described it as a time when the mind was particularly clear, freed from the dullness of daytime fatigue, not yet clouded by the return of sleep, existing in a state of relaxed alertness that felt different from either waking or sleeping. Modern sleep research has subsequently identified this state physiologically. The interval between two sleep periods shows elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with relaxation and a specific quality of alert calm. And the brain activity of this interval is distinct from both deep sleep and ordinary waking. The medieval characterization of the intersleep interval as spiritually significant, as propitious for prayer and reflection, was not merely theological convention. It was a description of a real quality of consciousness that the physiology of the sleep pattern produced, and that the people who experienced it recognized as distinct and valuable. The second sleep, the return to sleep after the waking interval, lasted from the end of the interval until dawn or shortly after. It was generally lighter than the first sleep, less dominated by the deep slow-wave sleep of the early night, and more characterized by the REM sleep in which dreaming occurred. The vivid dreams of the pre-dawn hours, familiar to anyone who has woken and returned to sleep in the early morning, were a recognized feature of the second sleep, and the interpretation of these dreams was a significant cultural practice in the medieval period. Dream interpretation was taken seriously as a source of information about the dreamer's physical and spiritual state. The medical traditions held that dreams reflected the humoral condition of the body. Specific types of dreams were associated with specific humoral imbalances, and the physician who asked a patient about their dreams was gathering diagnostic information. The theological tradition held that dreams could be vehicles for divine communication. The biblical tradition of significant dreams was alive and active in medieval religious culture, and the dream of the second sleep with its unusual vividness and narrative quality, was the dream most likely to be examined for meaning. The second sleep ended with dawn, or in the monastic context, with the bell for prime, the morning office, which was timed to coincide approximately with first light. The transition from second sleep to morning was easier than the transition from first sleep to waking in the night, because the morning had the direction of the day's beginning to give it purpose, and because the thermal regime of the morning, the revived fire, the warming of food, the resumption of the day's physical activity, worked to raise the temperature of the environment and the body simultaneously. The segmented sleep pattern was ended, gradually and unevenly, by the Industrial Revolution and the artificial lighting that accompanied it. Gas lighting and then electric lighting extended the productive and social hours of the evening, pushing the bedtime later and later. The factory schedule imposed a fixed early morning start time that required a specific sleep length. The combination of later bedtime and fixed early wake time compressed the available sleep into a single block. There was no longer time for the natural segmented pattern, and the single block sleep became the standard that was then, circularly, promoted as the correct and natural sleep pattern. The people in the 19th and early 20th centuries who woke in the middle of the night and couldn't get back to sleep for an hour or two. The people who consulted doctors about their middle-of-the-night wakefulness and were told they had a sleep disorder were, in many cases, simply experiencing the human default sleep pattern in conditions that no longer accommodated it. The disorder was the industrial schedule, not the sleep. The irony of this history is that the modern sleep science that identified the problem, that found evidence of the segmented sleep pattern in the pre-industrial documentary record, confirmed it in studies of volunteers kept in conditions without artificial light, and identified the specific physiological characteristics of the intersleep interval, is also the sleep science that is now telling modern people that their middle-of-the-night wakefulness is not necessarily pathological. That if you wake in the night and lie quietly for an hour and then fall back to sleep, you're doing exactly what your ancestors did for most of human history, and the problem is not you, but the schedule that doesn't accommodate your biology. Medieval people slept in 2 segments, with a quiet hour in between, and they used that hour for prayer and thought and intimacy, and the specific kind of reflection that the middle of the night, in the dark and quiet, enabled. They were not sleep-deprived in any structural sense. They were sleeping in the pattern that the human nervous system, freed from artificial constraints, tends to default to. And they were doing it in the cold, in the ways we've been describing, with the fires and the clothing, and the shared beds, and the warming foods, and all the other apparatus of medieval cold management that made the night survivable, and, within its specific limitations, livable. Chapter 8. The Night. Darkness, fear, and what the medieval night actually meant. The medieval night was dark in a way that the modern world has entirely forgotten. This is not a romantic observation. It is a physical fact with significant implications for how the night was experienced, what it meant, and what the social and psychological life of medieval people looked like in the hours between sunset and sunrise. Modern light pollution has eliminated genuinely dark sky from virtually all of Europe and North America. The average modern person living in or near an urban area has never experienced real darkness, the darkness of a pre-industrial night when there were no streetlights, no illuminated windows, no reflected glow of the city on the clouds, no screen light bleeding from neighboring houses. The darkness that was normal every night for the entire medieval population is now only available in remote rural areas or at sea, and it is, for people who have not experienced it, genuinely difficult to imagine. The medieval night was dark enough that, away from a fire or a candle, you could not see your hand in front of your face. Movement at night without a light source was movement in conditions that made navigation, even in familiar spaces, difficult, and movement in unfamiliar spaces dangerous. The night imposed a spatial confinement. You stayed where you were, near your light source, or you moved with extreme care in spaces you knew well enough to navigate by memory. Artificial light was available, but it was expensive. The candle, tallow candles for ordinary households, beeswax candles for the wealthy and for church use, was a manufactured item with a cost that made it a managed resource rather than an unlimited convenience. The rushlight, a rush soaked in tallow, a cheaper alternative to the candle that burned less cleanly and less long, was the poor household's artificial light. Both had to be managed carefully, and the decision to burn light through the night was a decision with a cost that most households didn't take lightly. The fire provided light as well as heat, and the fire's light, the warm, flickering illumination of an active fire, was the primary light source for the evening hours in most medieval households. The gradual dying of the fire through the night was also the gradual dying of the light, and the deep night, the hours after the fire had banked and the candles had been extinguished, was genuinely, thoroughly dark. This darkness shaped the psychological experience of the night in ways that the modern person who can banish darkness with a light switch has difficulty appreciating. The medieval night was the territory of things that the daylight kept at bay, not metaphorically, but experientially. The darkness that you couldn't see through was the darkness in which the imagination operated without constraint, because the visual information that daylight provides to anchor imagination to reality was absent. The supernatural fears of the medieval night were not primitive irrationality. They were a natural response to an environment of genuine sensory deprivation in which the things that went bump in the night, the animals outside, the settling of the building, the wind in the thatch, the sounds of the sleeping household, could not be visually confirmed as ordinary, and therefore retained the capacity to be extraordinary. The demon in the dark was not a medieval invention of a credulous population. It was the form that the amygdala's threat detection system took in conditions where no visual information was available to distinguish threats from non-threats. The Church's regulation of the night was in part a response to this. The prayers at Compline, the last office of the day at nightfall, included specific prayers for protection through the night, the commendation of the soul to God's keeping in the hours of vulnerability. The night prayer was not only spiritual, it was a psychological management strategy for the anxiety of the dark, providing a framework of divine protection that replaced the visual confirmation of safety that daylight provided. The curfew, the signal in towns and cities that fires should be covered and households should settle for the night, was both a fire safety measure and a social management of the night. The word itself comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire. The curfew bell marked the transition from the semi-public evening to the private night, from the time when streets were still occupied to the time when they were the territory of night watch, and the various figures, real and imagined, who populated the medieval night. The night watch was the urban response to the real dangers of the unlit medieval city at night. Watchmen patrolled the streets of medieval towns and cities, carrying lanterns, enforcing the curfew, responding to disturbances. The watch was not very effective. The darkness that limited everyone else's vision limited the watchmen's as well. But it was the institutional acknowledgement that the night was a specific time, requiring specific social management. The street crime of the medieval night was real. Robbery, assault, murder, all were more common at night than during the day, for the obvious reason that darkness provided cover for activities that daylight made visible and therefore deterred. The advice of the medieval period for people who had to travel at night was to travel with companions and with light, and the person who walked alone through the unlit streets of a medieval city after curfew was making a risk assessment that the period's crime statistics would not have fully supported. For the sleeping household, the night's dangers were primarily fire. The fire that was the center of the domestic thermal system was also the greatest domestic danger. The fire that escaped the hearth, the candle that fell, the spark that landed in the rushes. Fire was the leading cause of non-natural death in medieval domestic settings, and the management of fire safety at night was a genuine preoccupation of the period's domestic advice literature. The last person to bed was responsible for ensuring the fire was properly banked, not extinguished, which would mean a cold, fireless morning, but covered and reduced so that it burned safely overnight. The candles were snuffed rather than blown out. Blowing a candle sent burning embers drifting into the air, while snuffing produced a controlled, contained extinction. The rushes on the floor were swept away from the hearth area where sparks might land. The fire tools, the pokers, the tongs, the ash rakes were positioned for easy access in the dark. These fire safety practices were survival behaviors in the most direct sense. The medieval building's materials, timber, thatch, wattle, and daub, were combustible, and a fire that got into a thatched roof in the night was a fire that could kill the household before dawn. The fear of nighttime fire was rational and well-founded, and the domestic routines of the medieval evening were organized partly around managing it. The sounds of the medieval night were different from the sounds of the modern night in ways that shaped the experience of being awake in it. The absence of mechanical noise, no traffic, no HVAC systems, no electrical hum, meant that the sounds of the natural world were audible with a clarity that is entirely alien to most modern people. The wind, the animals, the movements of water, the sounds of other households, all of these were present in the quiet of the medieval night in ways that the modern person would find either beautiful or alarming, depending on their relationship to the natural soundscape. The domestic animals were part of the nighttime sound environment. The cattle in the longhouse shifted and breathed. The pig in the pen grunted. The dog, the household dog, that was simultaneously a guard, a pest controller, and a source of warmth for the people it slept near, moved and settled, and occasionally barked at something in the dark outside that had attracted its attention and whose nature was not clear. The dog, it should be noted, was a deliberate and important element of the medieval thermal system at night, particularly for the less wealthy households that had fewer other resources. A large dog sleeping against or near the household members was a meaningful source of warmth. The thermal output of a medium to large dog is comparable to that of a human child, and the dog's willingness to sleep in contact with its humans made it an effective living warming device. The phrase three-dog night, a night cold enough to require 3 dogs to keep warm, comes from this tradition. And while the phrase's origin is disputed, the practice it describes is well documented across many pre-industrial cultures. The night was long in winter. In northern Europe, at the winter solstice, darkness lasted 16 hours or more. The two-sleep pattern, with its waking interval, accounted for this extended darkness in a way that the single-block sleep pattern cannot. The 16 hours of winter darkness could not all be filled with continuous sleep, and the natural segmented pattern distributed the sleeping hours across the night in a way that matched the available darkness without requiring impossible continuous sleep. The transition from night to morning, the first light that ended the second sleep and began the day, was, in the medieval context, a genuine threshold of psychological as well as physical importance. The return of light was the return of the visual confirmation of safety, the retreat of the night's fears and uncertainties, the beginning of the activities that made the day purposeful. The morning prayer, prime, the first office of the day, timed to first light, Doho, was a celebration of this threshold, the thanks for having passed through the night's darkness and arrived at the morning's safety. The medieval experience of night was not the experience of an inconvenient darkness that had to be managed until the alarm clock ended it. It was a distinct world with its own texture, its own dangers, its own specific quality of consciousness. The praying wakefulness of the intersleep interval, the vivid dreams of the second sleep, the specific anxiety of genuine darkness, the sounds of the house and the animals, and the world outside reaching through the dark, that the modern elimination of real darkness has made essentially inaccessible. We have warmer beds and brighter nights. The medieval person who spent their night in the cold and the dark and the two-segment sleep was experiencing something genuine and specific that the modern comfort removes us from. Whether that removal is only a gain is a question that the sleep scientists, who identified the segmented sleep pattern, and the physiologists who studied the intersleep interval's distinctive brain chemistry might have some thoughts about. Chapter 9. The Seasons, How Winter and Summer Changed Everything About Medieval Sleep. The medieval year was not the smoothed-out, climate-controlled year of the modern person, where the temperature inside the building is approximately the same in January as in July, and the primary seasonal difference is what you're wearing outside and what's on the restaurant menus. The medieval year was enormous. The range between the worst of winter and the best of summer, in terms of temperature, light, food availability, physical comfort, and the quality of daily life, including the quality of sleep, was a range so wide that the person living through it experienced something closer to two entirely different lives within a single year. The management of this range was the organizing principle of the medieval calendar. The agricultural cycle, the food preservation system, the building practices, and, as we're about to establish, the entire culture of sleep. Let's start with winter, because winter is the subject this script was built around, and because winter in northern medieval Europe was a genuine and specific ordeal that the accumulated strategies we've discussed so far were designed to address. The medieval winter began, in practical terms, at Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin on November 11th, which was the date around which the agricultural cycle's winter transition was organized. Martinmas was the traditional date for the slaughter of animals that couldn't be fed through the winter, the pig primarily, the excess cattle, whatever livestock the household's winter fodder couldn't sustain. The meat that came from this slaughter was preserved through salting, smoking, and drying, and it constituted a significant portion of the household's winter protein supply. The Martinmas slaughter was also, incidentally, a thermal event. The rendering of fat from the slaughtered animals produced the tallow that was used for candles and rushlights, the artificial light that would see the household through the long winter nights. The pig's blood went into blood puddings. The bones were cracked for marrow, the marrow rendered for cooking fat. The Martinmas slaughter was a comprehensive resource extraction event from the animals that had been raising themselves in the fields and in the household for exactly this purpose, and the resources it provided were both caloric and thermal. Winter sleep was the sleep we've been describing throughout this script. The cold room, the warmed bed, the banked fire, the shared warmth, the segmented pattern with its waking interval in the deep cold of the night. But let's add some specific sensory detail to this picture, because the texture of a medieval winter night is worth inhabiting more fully. December, northern France or England. The temperature outside, perhaps -5 to -10 Celsius on a cold night. The frost hard on the ground. The water in the outdoor containers frozen. The temperature inside the stone manor house or the timber merchant's dwelling, perhaps 5 degrees Celsius in the unheated upper rooms where the family sleeps, perhaps marginally warmer if the fire in the room below has been sending heat through the floor. The bedroom fireplace, if there is one, has been built up before bed and is still contributing some warmth, but the fire in a stone fireplace in a stone room loses ground to the cold of the walls continuously. You get into the bed. The warming pan has done its work. The linen sheets are warm. The wool blankets are warm. The fur-lined coverlet is warm. You pull the bed curtains closed around you. The microclimate of the enclosed bed is perhaps 15 degrees Celsius. Cold by modern bedroom standards, but warm enough for comfortable sleep when you are wearing your chemise and your sleeping cap, and have 3 generations of cold management practice encoded in the bedding wrapped around you. Your bed companion, your spouse, your child, a guest if this is an inn, adds their body heat to the enclosed space. The temperature inside the curtained bed rises a degree or 2 more. You are in the specific enclosed warmth of the good medieval bed in winter, genuinely comfortable. Outside the curtains, cold. Inside, warm enough. The waking interval comes around midnight. You are briefly aware of the cold of the room as the consciousness of the intersleep wakefulness brings you to a state alert enough to register the temperature through the warmth of the bedding. You do not open the bed curtains unless necessity requires it. The prayer, the reflection, the quiet thinking of the intersleep interval happens in the warm dark of the enclosed bed space, your breath visible if you parted the curtains, invisible in the warmth within them. if you need the chamber pot. And if you are a person prosperous enough to have a chamber pot, you use it without leaving the bed's warmth. The transition is a brief, cold extraction from the warmth, conducted with efficient speed, followed by immediate return. If you do not have a chamber pot and need the outside latrine, the experience is the specific cold shock of moving from warm bedding to cold room to cold night air, conducted as quickly as possible. The return to bed a relief as physical as stepping from cold water to warm. The second sleep comes, the deep cold of the early hours before dawn. The coldest part of the 24-hour cycle, when the accumulated heat loss of the night has driven the temperature to its minimum, is the thermal challenge that the medieval sleeper system was designed to address. And the good medieval bed, properly managed, addressed it adequately for those who had access to it. Dawn, the revival of the fire, the cold morning, the pre-warmed outer garments, the hot pottage or the heated ale, the gradual warming of the house as the fires are built up for the day, the transition from the night's thermal regime to the day's. Winter sleep was managed. It was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was survivable, and the people who had the resources and the knowledge to manage it well were, within their specific conditions, sleeping adequately. Now let's turn to summer, because summer sleep is the part of the medieval thermal story that gets almost no attention, and that was, in its own way, as challenging as winter. Not for the obvious reason of cold, but for the less obvious reasons of heat insects and the specific problems of light. The medieval summer night was short. At the summer solstice in Northern Europe, darkness lasted perhaps 8 hours, and not the full 8 hours, but 8 hours, including the twilight periods at either end that were not true darkness, the practical dark of a Northern European. Summer night was perhaps 5 or 6 hours. This was not enough for the segmented sleep pattern's natural expression. The 2 sleep periods with the waking interval required more than 5 hours of darkness to play out in their natural form. The summer adjustment was an earlier bedtime relative to darkness, going to bed closer to sunset, and a shorter night overall, the second sleep ending at an earlier actual hour of the morning. The agricultural calendar assisted this. Summer was the season of the longest working days, when the extended daylight was used for the field work that the harvest required, and the earlier morning rising that the shorter night produced was compatible with the agricultural urgency of using every hour of summer light. Summer heat in the medieval period was not the problem that modern climate change has made it in the 21st century, but it was a real seasonal challenge for sleep in the warmer regions of medieval Europe. The Mediterranean South, the warmest summers of France and England. The management of summer heat was the inverse of the winter cold management. The fire that was the center of winter thermal strategy was a problem in summer, and the management of the summer sleeping environment involved reducing rather than retaining heat. The summer bed was made differently from the winter bed. The heavy fur-lined coverlet went away, stored laid aside for the warm months, its absence a seasonal marker as clear as the change of clothing. The heavy wool blankets were reduced or replaced with lighter linen coverlets. The wool mattress or the heavy feather mattress might be supplemented or replaced with a lighter sleeping surface. The bed curtains, which retained warmth in winter, retained heat in summer, and were often left partially open to allow air circulation. The windows of the summer sleeping room were the subject of competing considerations. Open windows allowed air circulation and temperature reduction. Open windows also allowed in the mosquitoes, flies, and other insects that were the specific summer plague of the medieval bedroom, particularly in the warmer and wetter regions where standing water created ideal insect breeding conditions. The medieval person's relationship with the mosquito was direct and unmediated by window screens or insect repellents in the modern form. The aromatic herbs, lavender, wormwood, tansy, elder, were used in summer sleeping rooms as insect repellents, strewn on the floor and hung in bunches near the sleeping area, their volatile compounds providing modest deterrence. This was better than nothing, and not as effective as modern insect management, which means that summer sleep In the medieval period, in regions with significant mosquito populations, was summer sleep accompanied by mosquitoes. The specific misery of trying to sleep in a hot room while mosquitoes conduct their business is universal across historical periods and requires no further elaboration. Medieval people hated it exactly as much as you would. The bed in summer was sometimes moved. In aristocratic and wealthy households, the summer sleeping chamber might be positioned on the cooler north side of the building, or in a ground floor room that was shielded from the sun's direct heat by its position. The wealthiest households had summer residences in cooler locations. The aristocratic practice of moving between different estates through the year was partly motivated by the management of seasonal conditions, including sleep comfort. The outdoor sleeping arrangements of the medieval summer, the servants sleeping in barns or outbuildings, the poor sleeping in the open on warm nights, the travelers sleeping under hedges or in the open fields, were the summer expressions of the flexibility with which the medieval sleeping culture approached the question of where to sleep. The bed was the ideal, but the ideal was not always available, and the medieval person's capacity to sleep in suboptimal conditions, on the floor, in the open, in the communal spaces of inn or great hall, was a practical adaptability that the less variable conditions of the modern sleeping environment have made largely unnecessary. The transition seasons, the particular cold of October as the year turned toward winter, the particular relief of April as the winter broke, were the seasonal moments most felt in the sleeping experience, because they marked the beginning and end of the period of maximum cold management effort. The first October night cold enough to require the full winter bed apparatus, the warming pan, all the blankets, the curtains drawn, was a felt threshold. The first April night mild enough to reduce the apparatus was a felt relief. The medieval calendar organized both of these transitions with religious observance. Michaelmas at the end of September and the approaching Martinmas, marking the move into winter, Easter, and the warming spring weeks marking the emergence from it. The religious calendar and the thermal calendar were aligned in ways that made the transition from cold to warm and warm to cold feel both divinely ordered and practically organized. The specific prayers at the seasonal transitions, the prayers for the harvest, the prayers for protection through the winter, the Easter thanksgiving for the return of warmth, encoded the thermal significance of the seasons in religious practice in a way that the centrally heated modern Christian celebrating Easter in a church maintained at 18 degrees, regardless of the outdoor temperature, has largely lost the felt meaning of. Spring in the medieval experience was not just metaphorically a relief. It was physically, sensorially, thermally a relief. The end of the 6 months of cold management, of the carefully banked fires, and the warming pans, and the shared beds, and the sleeping caps, and all the accumulated effort of surviving. The winter. The warmth of April was warmth that was earned by having managed the cold of November through March, and the appreciation of it was the appreciation of people who had genuinely needed it. Chapter 10. The Class Divide. What sleep looked like at the top and the bottom of medieval society. Everything we've been discussing comes with an asterisk, and the asterisk is this: the quality of your medieval sleep depended enormously on where in the social hierarchy you were, and the range between the top and the bottom was wide enough that medieval sleep is almost too broad a category to be useful. Let's establish the extremes, because the extremes illuminate the full range of what the medieval thermal challenge looked like at different resource levels. At the top, the king. The royal sleeping arrangements of the medieval period were elaborate, expensive, and specifically designed to be the best sleeping environment that the resources of a kingdom could produce. The royal bed was a statement of sovereignty as well as a sleeping place, and the investment in its quality was both practical and symbolic. The royal bed of a medieval English king, Henry III, Edward I, the Edwards of the 14th century, was a four-poster construction of the finest available timber, carved and painted and sometimes gilded, with a canopy hung with the finest textiles. Silk, if available. The richest wool, if not. The curtains were heavy enough to block drafts and retain warmth, lined with fur in winter. The The mattress was the finest goose down, built up in layers, not one mattress, but several, creating a sleeping surface of exceptional softness and insulation. The linen sheets were the finest available, changed regularly. The blankets were the best wool. The coverlet was fur-lined with ermine or sable, the furs of the most prestigious animals, restricted by sumptuary law to the royal household and the highest nobility. The royal bedchamber was heated, not merely by a fireplace in the room, but by a specifically managed fire that had been built up before the king's retirement, and that was attended through the night by servants whose job included ensuring that the chamber remained warm. The chamber was also hung with tapestries, not merely decorative, but thermal, the heavy woven textiles creating a layer of insulation between the stone walls and the room's interior, raising the effective room temperature by reducing the cold wall effect that made stone rooms so difficult to heat. The king's bed was warmed before he got into it, not with a simple hot stone, but with the finest copper warming pan, the coals carefully selected for the right temperature, the warming conducted by a designated servant who had the specific skill and the specific responsibility for ensuring that the royal bed was at the correct temperature when the royal person entered it. The king did not get into a cold bed, not because cold beds didn't exist in the palace, but because the palace's entire servant apparatus was organized to ensure that the king's experience of the cold night was managed to the greatest extent that was physically possible. The king did not sleep alone, or rather the king's bed was not entirely private. The royal bedchamber was attended by the highest-ranking household servants, the gentlemen of the bedchamber, whose proximity to the king's sleeping body was a marker of royal favor and political trust. The sleeping king was guarded, attended, and surrounded by the social apparatus of royalty in ways that the private bedroom of the modern imagination cannot quite contain. The food and drink before the royal bedtime were the finest available. The spiced wine, the rich dishes of the royal kitchen, the post-supper entertainment that kept the hall warm and bright before the retirement to the chamber. The king's body arrived at the bed in the best possible thermal state, fed, warmed from inside and outside, clothed in the finest linen, surrounded by the most elaborate bed technology available. The king slept well, not without the problems that all medieval sleepers shared. The cold of the deep night was real, even in the royal chamber. The insects of summer were no respecters of royal blood. The anxiety of the intersleep interval was a universal human experience that fine linen sheets did not prevent. But the king slept better than anyone else in his kingdom, and the difference between his sleep and the sleep of the least of his subjects was a difference in kind as much as degree. Now, the bottom. The landless laborer, the rural poor who worked for others, on the land that others owned, whose housing was provided by the Lord as a condition of their labor, whose food was what remained after the obligations of rent and tithe were paid, whose clothing was what they could make or acquire from the limited resources of their situation. The housing of the rural poor in the medieval period was, at its worst, a single-room structure of minimal construction, wattle and daub or turf walls, a thatched roof that was the building's primary defense against weather, a packed earth floor, a central fire that was the only heat source. No chimney, the smoke rose to the roof and found its way out as best it could. No glass windows, an opening in the wall, covered with oiled cloth or a wooden shutter, providing ventilation at the cost of some heat loss, and providing no ventilation when closed. No bed frame, a straw pallet on the floor, the whole family together, the warmth of combined bodies, the primary thermal resource. The clothing of the rural poor was minimal. Wool of the coarsest grade, worn continuously because there was no reserve wardrobe to change into, not laundered frequently because laundry required both water and the fuel to heat it. The sleeping garment was the same garment worn during the day because there was no separate sleeping garment, and the state of the garment after a day's physical labor in the fields was the state of the sleeping garment. The food of the rural poor was pottage, almost exclusively pottage, the grain and whatever stew that was the dietary baseline of the medieval peasantry. The fat content of the pottage depended on the household's animal resources, and in lean years it could be very low. The ale was the cheapest possible. Thin, weak, the minimum caloric supplement that the grain could provide. The special Martinmas pig, the animal that every peasant household was supposed to have for the winter slaughter, was aspirational for some and unreachable for others, and the households that went into winter without an animal to slaughter were the households whose pottage would be thin. The cold that these households faced was not the managed cold of the royal chamber. It was the cold of a poorly constructed building, with a fire that had to be maintained carefully because fuel was a limited resource, with bedding that was inadequate by any thermal standard, with food that didn't always provide the caloric density needed for the body's heat generation. Did people freeze to death? Occasionally, yes. The historical record contains cases of deaths from cold, particularly among the elderly, the ill, and the very young, in the worst winters of the medieval period, the winter of 1309 to 1310, the Great Frost of 1362 to 63, the devastating cold winters of the early 14th century that preceded the Great Famine. These produced cold mortality among the most vulnerable members of the population. But most people most winters did not freeze to death, and the reason is the collective cold management that the communal sleeping arrangement and the communal fire enabled, the family sleeping together on the straw pallet, the combined body heat of parents and children, the animals in the same space. This was not comfortable, but it was effective. The warmth generated by 5 human bodies and a cow or two in an enclosed space, however poor the construction of that space, was enough to keep the temperature above freezing even when the temperature outside was well below it. The specific mathematical reality of the poor family's thermal situation was, the poorer you were, the more you needed the bodies of your family members to survive the night. The communal sleeping that was a social norm across medieval society was, at the bottom of that society, a survival necessity rather than a preference. The family that could sleep apart, in separate beds, in separate rooms, was a family with the resources to heat those rooms separately, which was a family with considerably more resources than most medieval households had. Between the king and the rural laborer, the enormous varied middle of medieval society, the prosperous peasant with a good house and animals enough to eat, and a proper bed frame with a straw mattress and 2 wool blankets, the urban artisan with a timber-framed house, a proper fireplace, a wool mattress, and the ability to buy a warming pan, the merchant with a feather mattress and bed curtains, and a servant to tend the fire, the minor clergyman with the specific sleeping arrangements of the clerical life, the village priest with his one-room house and his relative prosperity compared to his parishioners. Each of these people experienced the medieval night differently, and the difference was primarily a function of the resources they could bring to the thermal challenge. The good house, the good bed, the good food, the good fire. These were what made the medieval night survivable at the higher levels of the social range, and their absence was what made it genuinely dangerous at the lower levels. The relationship between poverty and cold in the medieval period was direct and physiological. Not a metaphor, not a social commentary, a physical reality in which the resources you had determined the temperature at which you slept, and the temperature at which you slept determined the quality of your sleep and the state of your health in the morning. The rich slept warm, and the poor slept cold, and the cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was, over the course of a winter, a sustained physiological stress that contributed to the susceptibility to illness, the reduced immune function, and the general physical deterioration that made the medieval poor more vulnerable to the epidemic diseases and the periods of food shortage that periodically devastated the population. The class divide was never more literally a thermal divide than it was in the medieval sleeping chamber. The king in his fur-lined bed and the laborer on his straw pallet were, on any given winter night, inhabiting such different thermal environments that the biological experience of being human in medieval Europe was, in this most basic respect, profoundly different, depending on where in the hierarchy you were born. Chapter Vise. 11. The exceptions. Monks, night workers, and the medieval treatment of insomnia. So far, we've been describing the typical, the representative medieval sleeper, managing their cold night with the resources available to them and the patterns we've been establishing. But the medieval night also contained people who were sleeping outside the typical patterns, and their experiences illuminate the broader picture from unexpected angles. The monks were the most institutionally distinctive sleepers of the medieval period, and their relationship to the night was organized by the rule of Saint Benedict into a structure that shaped the religious life of Europe for the entire medieval period. The Benedictine night office, the divine office as prescribed by the rule, divided the night into a series of prayer times that required the monks to rise from their beds at specific hours. The sequence was compline at the end of the evening, approximately 7 to 9 p.m. depending on the season, then sleep. Then the night office of vigils, or matins in the deep night, approximately midnight to 2 a.m., then lauds at dawn, then prime at first light. The structure of the night office mapped almost exactly onto the natural segmented sleep pattern. The first sleep ran from after compline to the night office. The night office corresponded to the natural waking interval, and the second sleep ran from after lauds until prime. Whether the rule's architects deliberately designed the night office to coincide with the natural sleep pattern, or whether the coincidence was organic, the recognition that people would naturally wake in the middle of the night, and the organization of that waking time into prayer, is a question that can't be answered definitively. But the alignment was real, and it meant that the monastic schedule, for all its spiritual discipline, was not violating the natural sleep biology of its practitioners in the way that, say, a modern night shift does. The monks of a cold northern monastery, Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, the Cistercian houses of the Scottish borders, the Benedictine foundations of the Rhine Valley, faced the specific cold of the monastic dormitory, which was an unheated or minimally heated large room, whose thermal properties were the product of many bodies in the same space and very little else. The Cistercian reform of the 12th century specifically forbade fires in the dormitory. The austere Cistercian interpretation of Benedictine simplicity extended to the sleeping quarters, and the monks of the stricter orders slept in the cold of the unheated dormitory as a form of penitential discipline. This was genuinely, seriously cold in the winter months of a northern European monastery. The thermal management of the monastic dormitory was the bodies of the monks themselves, the woolen habits they slept in as the rule required, and the straw mattresses and wool blankets that the rule permitted, which were themselves the subject of ongoing regulatory tension between the comfort that practical survival required and the austerity that the Reformed tradition demanded. The monastic cold was understood within the spiritual framework of the mortification of the flesh, the deliberate acceptance of physical discomfort as a discipline of the spiritual life, the training of the will to overcome the body's preferences. The monk who lay in the cold dormitory and did not complain was practicing a specific spiritual discipline. The monk who lay in the cold dormitory and complained was failing one. The cold was spiritually functional in the monastic tradition in a way it was not in the secular world, where it was simply an unavoidable problem to be managed as effectively as possible. The night workers of medieval society were a different kind of exception, not sleeping on a modified schedule by spiritual choice, but working through hours that other people slept because their work required it. The baker was the archetypal medieval night worker. The bread that a medieval city needed to be available in the morning had to be baked overnight. The leavening process, the heating of the oven, the baking itself, and the cooling all required time that had to begin well before dawn if bread was to be available at market opening. The medieval baker worked through the night by necessity, and the bakehouse, heated by the oven that was the baker's working tool, was one of the warmest environments in the medieval city after dark. The night watchman, as we've discussed, patrolled through the dark. The midwife was called at any hour that labor required, which was frequently in the middle of the night. the physician making emergency calls, the priest administering last rites to the dying. The professions whose services didn't respect the social boundary of the night were worked through it by the demands of their role. The night work of the miller deserves specific mention, because the mill, the water mill or windmill that was the primary mechanical processing technology of medieval agriculture, could only operate when the water was flowing or the wind was blowing, which was not always during daylight hours. The miller who had wind at 2 in the morning, ground grain at 2 in the morning, the alternative being lost productive capacity that the agricultural economy couldn't afford. These night workers slept in the day, or tried to. The specific difficulty of daytime, sleeping in the medieval environment, the light that the winter-adapted sleeping culture was organized to avoid, but that the summer imposed regardless, the noise of the household and the street that didn't quiet for the day sleeper as the night quieted for the night sleeper, was a genuine challenge that the documentary record occasionally acknowledges. The baker who slept in the afternoon heat of the bakehouse after the night's work was a recognized figure in the specific quality of the post-workday sleep. Heavy, fast, the sleep of genuine exhaustion rather than the managed sleep of the regular night, was noted. Insomnia. The medieval period had it, recognized it, and treated it with the tools available. The medical literature's approach to sleeplessness was organized through the humoral framework. Insomnia, the inability to sleep, was understood as a symptom of humoral imbalance, most commonly of the kind associated with excess heat or excess black bile. The heated, anxious, wakeful person who couldn't sleep was suffering from an excess of the fiery humors, yellow bile, the hot and dry quality, that kept the mind active when it should be settling. The melancholic person who lay awake in dark rumination was suffering from black bile excess, the cold and dry quality that produced the specific wakeful anxiety of the depressive temperament. The treatments prescribed for insomnia in the medical literature were accordingly organized around cooling and moistening the excess heat, or warming and drying the cold bile, depending on the diagnosis. Cool, moist foods for the hot insomniac, warming, drying foods for the melancholic one. The spiced wine that was the standard evening drink was itself considered mildly sleep-promoting in moderate quantities, the warmth of the spices counteracting the cold of the night, the alcohol producing relaxation. Excessive amounts of spiced wine, on the other hand, produced the hot, restless wakefulness of alcohol's stimulant phase, which the medical literature also noted. Herbal preparations for sleep were extensive, and some of them were genuinely effective. The preparations derived from the poppy, opium in various concentrations, were sleep-producing in a reliable and powerful way that the physicians of the period were well aware of. The use of poppy preparations for insomnia, for pain management at night, and for the sleep of the acutely ill was a standard medical practice, and the effectiveness was real, even if the theoretical explanation was wrong. Lettuce was specifically recommended for insomnia in the medieval medical literature. The soporific property of lettuce was noted in the ancient tradition and transmitted through the medieval texts. This is not as absurd as it sounds. Lettuce contains lactocopicrin, a mild sedative compound, and the ancient and medieval observation of its sleep-promoting property was a genuine empirical observation rather than a theoretical construction. Lavender, the aromatic herb that was strewn in beds and sleeping chambers, was recommended for both its insect-repelling properties and its sleep-promoting ones. And the modern aromatherapy tradition of lavender as a sleep aid is a direct continuation of a medieval practice whose empirical basis includes real compounds with real effects on the nervous system. The lavender pillow of contemporary sleep hygiene products would have been entirely familiar to a medieval household manager. The specific medieval treatment for the insomnia of the anxious mind, the mind that couldn't settle because of worry or grief, or the specific quality of the intersleep wakefulness extended beyond its natural duration, was the recommendation to pray. The night prayer as a sleep treatment was both spiritually and practically sound. The focused, repetitive quality of prayer was a genuine anxiety management technique, whose modern cognitive behavioral equivalent is something like the progressive relaxation scripts of sleep medicine, directing the mind to a specific known repetitive text the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, the Psalms, provided an alternative to the ruminative anxiety that made sleep difficult, and whose specific quality of deliberate, rhythmic focus produced the relaxation that anxiety prevented. The combination of the herbal preparations, the prayer, the warm drink, the cooling or warming of the body through food, and environment depending on the humoral diagnosis, the shared sleeping that provided the specific comfort of human presence. The medieval treatment of insomnia was, in its overall package, a recognizable set of sleep hygiene practices whose individual components have varying degrees of empirical support, but whose combined effect was probably more useful than the theoretical framework that organized them. The medieval insomniac who lay awake in the dark, unable to sleep, and prayed their way to rest was doing something that a modern sleep therapist would recognize as effective stimulus control and relaxation induction, without the need for the CBT terminology that the modern sleep therapist would use to describe it. Sleep was taken seriously in the medieval period, not with the clinical precision of modern sleep science, but with the practical seriousness of people who understood that a bad night's sleep made the next day difficult, and that the management of sleep was part of the management of health. The medical literature's attention to sleep, to its duration, its timing, its conditions, its disorders, was genuine and sustained. The recommendation of adequate sleep as a component of the healthy life was explicit in the medical texts and in the moral literature that drew on them. The specific recommendation for adequate sleep in the medieval medical tradition was organized around the non-naturals we discussed earlier. Sleep and waking being one of the 6 non-natural factors that the physician was supposed to assess in every patient. The person who slept too little was as medically problematic as the person who slept too much, and the balance of sleep and waking was a genuine component of the physician's assessment of the patient's overall condition. This serious attention to sleep was embedded in the church's regulation of the day as well. The night offices were organized around sleep as well as around prayer. The rules accommodation of the human need for sleep, the specific allowance for post-matins return to bed, the recognition that the monk's body needed rest as well as his soul needed prayer, reflected the institutional acknowledgement that sleep was a legitimate and important need rather than a moral failing. The medieval night was cold, dark, interrupted, shared, managed, prayed through, and taken seriously as a distinct domain of human experience with its own requirements, its own dangers, and its own specific gifts. The quiet of the intersleep interval, the warmth of the shared bed, the comfort of the banked fire, the specific quality of the pre-dawn second sleep. These were real experiences with real value, embedded in a culture that had developed the practices to make the cold night not merely survivable, but, within its limitations, livable. Conclusion. Let's come back to the cold. You are, once again, at 2 a.m, but you've been here long enough now to know what's actually happening. Around you, in the house, in the bed, in the body, trying to sleep in this specific cold, pre-modern night. The fire is banked under its ash. The coals are there, slowly releasing their heat into the room at a rate that the cold walls are absorbing as fast as it's produced. The temperature in the room is cold in a way that a modern person would find alarming, but that you have, over the course of this script, been given some tools for managing. You are wearing your linen chemise and your sleeping cap, the cap covering your ears, tied under your chin. You are under 2 wool blankets and a coverlet. You are not alone in the bed. There is warmth on your left from the other person, sharing your sleeping space. Warmth that is different from the warmth of the blankets, the animal warmth of another body that has been generating heat for the last several hours and will continue generating it until morning. The temperature under the blankets is meaningfully warmer than the temperature of the room. You are in the waking interval between your first and second sleep. The quality of this wakefulness is the specific, calm alertness that the physiology of the intersleep interval produces, not the gritty, anxious wakefulness of the modern insomniac, but the alert quiet of a person whose brain is doing something specific and recognized and expected. You have been here before. Every night you have been here. You are not cold exactly. You are aware of the cold of the room, the small cold of your nose above the blankets, the cold you will encounter if you need to move from this warm space. But you are, inside the blanket and beneath the coverlet and beside the other warm body, adequately warm. The warming pan's work is hours old, but the body heat has maintained the enclosed space. The sleeping cap is doing its job. The banked fire is doing its quiet, sustained work. The medieval approach to cold sleep was never a single solution. It was a system, layered, redundant, deeply practical, embedded in every aspect of life, from the building's construction to the evening's food to the social arrangements of who slept where. No single element of the system was sufficient on its own. The good bed without the fire was cold. The fire without the good bedding was heat that escaped before it reached the sleeping body. The shared warmth without adequate food was bodies that didn't generate enough heat to share. The system worked because all its parts worked together, and the knowledge of how to run the system was as much a part of the medieval person's competence as any other survival skill. The rich had a better version of the system: better fire management, better bedding, better food, better architecture. The poor had a more precarious version: thinner blankets, colder rooms, less food in the pottage. But both were working the same system, the same accumulated practical wisdom of how to keep a human body alive and sleeping through a Northern European winter without central heating or insulated walls or any of the technologies that the modern world takes as baseline. What's striking when you inhabit this picture fully is how much of it was social. The warming of the medieval night was not primarily a technological achievement. It was a communal one. The family in the same bed, the animals in the same space, the servants in the hall near the dying fire, the monks in the dormitory, their collective warmth raising the temperature of a room that no individual body could have kept adequate. The medieval cold was managed primarily by people being together, sharing warmth in the literal, physical, thermodynamic sense. The human bodies distributed through the sleeping spaces in arrangements that maximized the collective thermal output. We have solved the problem of cold in sleep through technology, through radiators and insulated walls and electric blankets and thermostats. And in solving it, technologically, we have largely removed the social dimension that the pre-technological solution required. The modern bedroom is private and temperature controlled, and occupied by one or at most two people. And this is comfortable, and also a specific arrangement that medieval society would have recognized as the luxury of the very rich, the arrangement available to the few who had enough resources to heat a private room for a small number of sleepers. Medieval sleep was cold and communal, and segmented and long in winter and short in summer, and managed with a practical ingenuity that the modern world has largely forgotten because it no longer needs it. It was also in the warmth of the shared bed, in the quiet prayer of the intersleep interval, in the hot pottage before bed, and the revived fire in the morning, a human experience with specific textures and specific comforts that the modern sleeping culture, for all its thermal superiority, doesn't quite replicate. The two, in the morning of the medieval night, was cold and dark and quiet in a way the modern world cannot produce, and it was shared, and the fire was still going under its ash, and the second sleep was coming. It was enough for most people, most nights. It was enough, and now you know how.